Okay, so we are looking at, as we said, a solution for command line to-do list with callbacks. This is the to-do list app that adds, keeps track of your tasks, lets you complete them. Just been poking around with it here in the console. It seems to be working great. So here are our files. Let's look at task.js and see what's going on. So looks like we're acquiring in 3 other files, one for each of the different commands. And then we're grabbing the third command line item from argv, calling that input, and getting the third one and calling that args, the fourth one, I guess, third index. And then if input is list, then we call a list function and we pass it the console.log function. I'm assuming that's like a callback. And then else if the input says add, then we call the add function with the arguments. Otherwise, if it's done, we call the done function with the arguments. So a couple things stand out to me. First is I love how little code there is in this file. This file is doing one thing, right? It's like, look at the command that was typed and then decide what to do is the only thing this file is doing. And actually like doing the thing that needs to be done doesn't happen here. It like that gets delegated to these functions. So it makes this like really easy to parse through for me. So like coming into a new application, I can like open this file, which is kind of the entry point, and like I can see the whole shape of the application right here. And I don't have to like be thinking like there's nothing in here about like reading and writing from JSON files and like parsing strings and like all that's hidden. And this is just like real high level, which is a really nice, nice way to build it. And so, yeah, 10 points to Gryffindor for that. So, and the other things that kind of stand out to me, one is input is kind of a vague variable name. And so like, I'm not sure just from reading this like input, what that's going to be. It looks like, you know, I can see from the code here that like it's like the command that's being invoked. So like maybe command would be a better name for that argument than input. Just because like there's multiple, there's like 2 different things you're pulling from the input, right, of the args list. So calling one of them input and another one args is like, it's a little vague. This is like clean enough code that it was, you know, it's instantly clear what's going on. But just as like a good muscle to build, like always think about variable names. And things like value or input or like really generic sounding words often become problematic later on as the code gets more complicated, and you kind of lose like, wait, which input was that? And so yeah, that's kind of my only comment here, is that these variable names could maybe be a little more specific. But then, yeah, let's look at the command lines. And I meant to say this in case it's not clear. If you have questions at any time, please interrupt me, whether it's like questions about the code, like how does that work, or questions about doing a code review, or questions about me, you want to know more about myself. I'm happy to be interrupted.
I have a question about the parenthesis spacing.
Yes.
In the else if lines and the if line.
Ah, yeah. That's a good catch. I didn't notice that.
Asymmetric in all 3 cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's like a space here, and then there's spaces here. I didn't catch that early on, but yeah, it probably does make sense to pick something and be consistent. I personally have a preference for like having the parentheses like right up next to the thing that they're around. Some people will put spaces in them, which is fine. There's no law against it. But yeah, you'd probably just want to be like, make sure you're consistent. And that's something that like, if you're using a linter, that would catch for you, is like kind of inconsistent spacing. But that's a good eye. And that's another thing that is a valuable thing to look at in code reviews. Some people will get really annoyed if you give them lots of feedback about their like spacing or syntax or those types of things. But it does help when you're working with a group of people, like on a team, you're reviewing each other's code, to like figure out the way you want the code to look, like what conventions you're going to follow, and then like stay consistent with them. It just gets a lot easier. And a lot of times that means you're going to be writing code using like a formatting pattern that you're just not thrilled with. But it ends up being a lot easier to do something that's consistent than to do something that's your favorite. At Learner's Good, actually, the code we wrote, there are some things about the way we format the code that I personally don't like. But I'm happy to like go along because it's what the majority likes to do. And if all of our code looks the same, it's just a lot easier to read. Especially have multiple people editing the same file, you don't want to keep switching back and forth between like the way you group parentheses, things like that. Cool. All right, so let's go look at these in order. So we got a commands list.js file here. So let's see, we're using fs from node and path. And we are doing a path resolve dir name. So this here is getting us a fully qualified path, an absolute path to this list.json file. It's kind of taking the relative path and then like converting it to an absolute path using the __ dir name, which if you haven't seen that before is like this magic node global that always holds the current working directory. Or the directory of the current file, probably. Do you remember which it is, Michael? Is it the current directory of the program or the directory that the file is in that you're in?
I believe it's the current directory of the program. That way you can download it from Node to your computer, and then it just automatically populates the directory for you, so you don't have to write it out.
All right. I will believe you on that one. Okay, so then we got a list function here that takes a callback like we saw in the other file, and it's calling read file using that JSON path. And then it takes a callback, throws errors if there are any, parses the data from the file. And so this is interesting here. I'm surprised to see data.toString before we call parse, because my understanding is that data here, when you read the file, is going to be a string already. So, I mean, this is safe. It won't hurt anything. But I'm surprised that it's there. It makes me wonder if there's something I don't know that like it's needed to convert things. Michael, is there a reason that you put that there specifically? Was like that solving a problem that you ran into?
Yes, because I remember data coming through was coming as like a buffer kind of a situation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I think you could, instead of just parsing, you might be able to do just like JSON stringify, but this is why I wanted to get a code review, is because there was a lot of things that I did in this program that kind of just like it was one thing that led to another.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hear you. All right, I'm gonna. So this is another good code review moment, and this happens a lot in code reviews where like I'll come across a piece of code and I'm like, huh, I'm surprised to see that there. And a lot of times it's because, contrary to popular belief, mainly my own, I don't know everything. And so I'll find code and be like, huh, I don't know what that is. I wonder if this is like a learning opportunity for me. So a lot of times what I'll do is, what is the name of this directory? Node something or other? Node. No, it's in code review, node to-do list. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna use the right version of Node, and then I'm really curious to see what happens if I just delete that and see if it's really necessary. Because I feel like I was just doing this exercise the other day and I didn't need it. So let's give that a shot. Node, what is this? This is the list, right? So node task list. Okay, so it seems to work without it. It seems like whether it's a buffer or a string, it's something that like JSON parse might be like coercing it to a string by default, but it looks like you don't need that to string there. It clearly wasn't hurting anything. But if it's not needed, I'd say leave it off just for making the code a little cleaner. So we're parsing the data, and then we're printing out this header, and then we're filtering the data that came back to exclude completed tasks. So if completed is equal to false, then we'll put that in our filtered array. Otherwise, we ignore it.
Doesn't this header presuppose that there are no more than 99 IDs?
It does, yeah. Yeah, the formatting here would get a little weird if you had triple-digit IDs or 5-digit IDs. In fact, you can kind of already see as it scrolls down here, once you get into 2-digit IDs, like the bar kind of gets off because now like the ID is longer. And that wasn't something that was called out specifically in the specs, but that's a great way to be thinking about like, what happens when there's a million of these? Then things would start to get kind of wonky. So yeah, that might be something as like, as refactoring to figure out like, how would you solve that problem of figuring out like, how wide does that column need to be? And like printing the right number of spaces in the header. The other things I'm noticing here are this let. You're using a let for the filtered array, but it's not ever getting changed. So that could probably be a const. And again, it doesn't have any effect on how the code works, but it's a nice clue to other developers that like, I'm not changing this thing. When I see a let, I'm sort of assuming that later on you're intending to modify that array or modify that variable, which doesn't look like it doesn't look like that happens. And this is another style thing, but when you have a Boolean and you're trying to like do a test to see if it's true or false, since it's already a Boolean value, like completed is already going to be true or false. If you want to check for false, a lot of times you'll see this instead and just say not data completed, which is probably just a little more idiomatic, which in other words, like it's more commonly what's seen and it's a little shorter to type and read. So it's probably kind of a preferred syntax, but that'll do the same. It'll do the same thing for you. And filter array, and then we're mapping through the array and then logging out each row. And so one thing to note here is that map is used. So the idea of map is that like it passes every item of the array to a function, and then that function transforms that item somehow and returns a new version. Sort of maps something from A to B, which is kind of what's called map. So in this case, when you're not really trying to like build a different version of the array, you're just trying to do something for each item of the array. A for each is probably more what you're looking for. Again, like functionally it's the same, but it's going to be a little confusing for developers to come and to see you mapping something and but then not like storing the result anywhere. So anytime you see like a map where there's not some sort of a const thing equals in front of it, that's kind of a smell that like maybe you meant to be doing a for each or some other kind of a loop. So you could do this, and I believe that would work almost the same. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's all minor stuff, but in general, this is really nice. And again, like here's a file that's just doing one thing, right? It's the logic for listing out the tasks. So that's really nice. It's 18 lines long, so it's like easy to kind of get your head around. You can see it all on one screen. It's formatted nicely. A lot of nice stuff here. And I like how this JSON file path is getting calculated as a constant outside of the function. It's a small thing, but it's like you only need to do that once. That file is always going to be in the same place. So no need to push that like inside the function. It's kind of nice that it's out here as a constant. Anybody else have questions like about the code for Michael or anything else about this file before we move on? Things I didn't catch? No? All right. Okay, so moving on to what's next. Let's do add next. All right, so this looks like it starts off really similarly. We're using FS and path. But we're pulling the path again. So this is interesting here. You're pulling the JSON file path. You're like defining it here again. And this, I think, happens in like all three of the files. And so when you see duplication like that, you want to start to ask yourself, like, is there like a common place I could put that? Because right now, if you changed the location of this file, you'd have to go and remember and like update it in 3 different places, which it can just lead to bugs later.
Could I put that in task.js, and would that work?
Yeah, you could put it in task.js and like pass it into these methods if you wanted to as like a configuration. The other option would be to create a new file and stick this there and export it, and then just like import that file from other places. So you could have like a function that just returns the file path. Like JSON file path could be a function that you're importing from some other like util.js file or something like that. So then we've got these lets being defined out here, and this smells a little bit like maybe something that while you were like playing with something, you put these here and they just got left because they're not actually used anywhere. Like we have a task argument to this function, and there's an ID const that gets defined down here on line 14, but I think these are probably just leftover assignments, I would guess, from something else because they're not actually used. So those could probably just be removed. And this is another good reason for code reviews, because that's a common thing. I'm always like accidentally leaving like debugging statements in my code or comments or whatever, and it's nice to get someone else to walk through it that hasn't been staring at it all day to notice like, oh yeah, that's left over from a previous version. So then we got a new task function. So again, this is a small thing, but new task, the function you're defining here is new task, but the name of the file is add. And so it's just like a little cognitive dissonance there. Usually you want to name if you have a file that's like just exporting one function, usually you name the function the same as the file, just for consistency, sanity. Then we're doing a read file and run the error again, parsing the data, and then task object.length +1. So you're creating an ID based on the length of the list. So you're kind of figuring out what the new ID is going to be, and then pushing an object onto the task list that has the task and the ID and is not completed by default. Makes sense. And then using stringify updated task list to like convert the updated task list back into a string. And this like longer version of stringify with null 2, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but this 2 is like, just gives you a little bit more pretty formatted JSON. Is that right? Yeah, okay. That's kind of nice. So I imagine if we look in the, what's it called? List.json file. Yeah, okay, so you get this nice, like, it's not all on one line. That's kind of nice. Cool. So, and then we're writing the file back out and logging the result. And returning the task object. So, cool. So there's a couple other things that jump out to me here. With this, there's a few more like constants being declared that aren't ever used. So you're assigning the return value of read file into this constant called current list. And maybe this was left over from a version where you're using like read file sync or something. But read file actually, like, it's asynchronous, so it's going to return right away, and it's not going to return anything that came out of the file. And you're not actually, current list isn't being used anywhere. So that's probably just unnecessary code. And then again, like down here at the end of the callback, you have a return statement here where you're returning the task object. But since this is a callback, like nothing is actually listening or waiting for that return. The callback sort of executed for its side effects. So I don't think you need the return statement either. So that just kind of can clean up this function a little bit. Yeah, let me just make sure that those changes didn't break something that I wasn't aware of. But node add puppies, yay. Yeah. So,
Hey, Trevor, those global variables up top, from my understanding, I was defining them to be changed later inside of the callback function itself. As far as like, so like if we comment those out, would it still work?
Yeah, let's give it a shot. So if we comment those out and we go to add, add another task, earn all the things. That was supposed to be learn all the things, but I guess earn all the things works too. Yeah, so it works without them. So what's happening here is that you have a const ID on line 14. So that's gonna, it's gonna hide anything that's like defined at this like outer scope. Like this let ID isn't even gonna be visible inside this function because you're defining another variable here named const ID, and that one sort of overrides it. And same thing with the task. Like you define a task here, but you're declaring a function parameter called task, which is gonna kind of override. That's gonna mask like the more global task that you're setting up here. So these aren't used. That makes sense? So yeah. Anybody else have questions about this code or comments? All right. So one more. There's the done. Dun, dun, dun. So this is starting to look familiar, right? Read the file. We've got this current list thing again here, which can probably go away. And we are, sorry. So here you're creating an index that is the ID -1. I gotcha, because it's a zero-based array. You're marking that one to true if it's false. And then doing the same kind of stuff here to stringify the object back in the task list and then write it back. This line here, line 18, I don't think is doing anything. You're sort of like assigning the task in the list to task ID. But at this point, updated task list is a string, not an array. And then you're assigning it to this task ID, but not using it. So I'm guessing this is just left over from like a previous version. So that can probably go away. And then again, this like return statement isn't used. So I would, I guess I'm gonna comment these out so you can still see them, but I would like get rid of these guys and then sort of get rid of this assignment up top because you don't need that. And another way that you could simplify this also here is you've got this if statement saying if completed is true, sorry, if completed is false, set it to true. If completed isn't false, then it's already true. So setting it to true is kind of a no-op. So you could actually just get rid of that if statement altogether and just like set it to true all the time. If it's already true, it's not a big deal. Doesn't hurt anything. And that's just, you save 2 lines of code. You save a little bit of a complexity by like introducing an if statement. Yeah, So, and then just like some general things that I've noticed in these three files, you do have some duplication. So in each of these files, you start off by, figuring out where the file is that you need to read, and then reading it, handling errors, and then parsing the data that you read as JSON and like converting it to this task object. And you do that in all three of the files. So that's actually a really good opportunity to like you could just create a new function that did that. So you could, in like some sort of a common file or util file, you could create a function called like read or like load tasks, right? That just takes a callback. And then you could just stuff this stuff inside there. And then use it in all of your other methods, and then just like call the callback with the parsed tasks. And that would sort of clean up this first part where you had this repeated thing. And just that like avoiding duplication will just save you time later. If you ever decide there's a better way to read in the file, you don't have to go and update it in 3 different places. If you decide to start storing this in a database instead of like a flat file on disk, like you could go and change this one method and none of the other logic has to care like where it came from. It just needs to know call load tasks to load it. So that would be like a refactoring suggestion that I'd offer probably. And similarly, when you write the file, you're doing that a few times. Like once you've updated the object, then you write it, and that sort of always happens the same way. The only thing that's different is like the console log that happens afterwards. So that's another place where you could kind of wrap that up into a file. So you could potentially like create a new file in this project called good names escape me, but you could have a file that just took care of your like read and write operations, right? So your data fetch and retrieve. And it could just have like a load tasks and save tasks method. And then that would be the only place in that file would be the only place you'd actually have to know this JSON file path. So it could live in there and just be a constant in that file. And the only 2 methods that would ever need it would be in that file. And then again, like I said, then you have all of your like data storage and retrieval logic isolated all by itself. And so it's really easy to go in there and change if you wanted to then like in a future version, like store this in a database or store it in an Amazon cloud instance or EC3 or whatever. Yeah. But overall, really good job on this. I like the way the code was separated, and it's all, it's really easy to like read through and understand what was going on. Yeah, it's mostly small syntaxy kind of comments. And I appreciate you being brave enough to be the first one to offer code to be read in front of your peers.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, thank you. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. There's a whole bunch of things in the chat. Have I been ignoring questions that have been typed in the chat? Constant file. Okay, someone's asking about, does var and let in the same file cause problems, or is it just bad style? It does not cause problems. Let and const are sort of newer things, and var is sort of the old way to do things. And var and let are pretty much identical. So it's probably more just like of a style thing that like probably more of like a modern syntax thing to just use let and const all the time to be specific instead of using var. And is there a standard format for JSON? I've seen it as an object of objects and also an array of objects. Yeah, so JSON is just, it's a notation for describing data as a string, like in a file. And it can actually be it doesn't have to be an array or an object. So I'm going to just open a node console here so we can play with this. So we saw things like 1, 2, right? That's valid JSON. And if I call parse on it, it should not yell at me. Totally yelled at me because piece, yeah. Computers are so picky. So yeah, so like a raw array is valid JSON, and like you said, an object, as long as you put strings around the keys, is valid, right? The other cool thing about JSON is that any valid type is valid JSON. So that the number 1 is a valid JSON string, and so is a string in quotes. Is also valid JSON. So there's nothing in the specification that says, you know, any JSON string or JSON file has to be like an object or has to be an array. There's a handful of valid types in JSON, and they're all valid JSON even if they appear all by themselves. So there's like numbers, strings, objects, arrays. I think that's it. There's not like a date type in JSON. It's a really good question. Oh, and null. So the string, I think it's null. Yeah. So null is another valid type in JSON. So you can have nulls in arrays. But for instance, undefined is not. It will get very mad at you for that. Cool. Let's see. Are there things like FS and JSON parts of Node? Yes, FS is definitely part of Node. So Node is a JSON environment. Sorry, it's a JavaScript environment to be run on a server as opposed to in a browser. So when JavaScript, back when JavaScript was only run in browsers, there wasn't any concept of like file system IO. It'd be super scary if a JavaScript applet in your like computer could just like start randomly reading files off of your computer. So there is no like concept of that. It won't work in a browser, but it is something that Node provides because for like a server-side programming language, you need to be able to interact with files. And JSON is actually part of the JavaScript standard. So JSON is going to show up even in your browser, that JSON constant. So like if we open up a console here, just in any old browser page, JSON is defined. And all this stuff works in here too. As long as you, oh wow, it's pickier though. That's interesting. Yeah, so it is there. I guess implementations may vary by browser, but both of those things are built in, so you don't need to install them. The FS thing you do have to require, and then JSON is just, it's a global that's defined in any JavaScript environment. It's just always available. Okay. So I had one more submission for code to look at, but I didn't get a chance to review it before we started, and it's a little bigger. And we've just got like 20 minutes left, so I'm probably not going to dive into another thing. I'm going to kind of hold that one in my back pocket probably, and then do it next week. But we do have a little bit of time left. If y'all have any other questions, we can just kind of move into a sort of an office hours situation. If y'all have any other questions you want to ask about anything, stuff you're stuck on, stuff you wanted me to talk about or do an example of, we've got the time, and I'm happy to stick around and help. Or if you want to leave, it will not hurt my feelings.
Can I ask about this code on the left side in line 9? Could JSON.parse data be put into the argument list of callback instead of tasks, and then line 9 deleted? And if so, would that generally be considered better, worse, or
Ah, you're talking about up here in this function that I
Yeah.
wrote here.
Yeah.
So let me see. So you're saying, could I do?
On line 9,
Yeah.
could you take JSON.parse data and just put that string into the argument? Yeah, and delete line 9. Would that be possible? And would that be equivalent? And would it be, and if so, would it be considered stylistically better, worse, or neither?
Yeah, so it's definitely possible. It does the exact same thing. It's just, yeah, it's a less verbose way of saying the same thing. And there are pros and cons, I would say. I'm hesitant to give like a blanket statement about like always do that or never do that. You'll definitely see me doing that where I'll just like call a function and then like wrap the result in another function like we had here. And I would say this is one of those situations that if you can convince the person who's reviewing your code that it's a good idea, then it's probably a fine idea. But you can get into dangerous situations where you're going to parse the data and then you're going to like verify the data, and you could just wrap that, and you get into these situations where you have one line of code that's very dense and like 3 different functions are being called and stuff is getting passed back and forth. And it can get hard to follow. So you just want to keep an eye on like how complex is a single line of code getting. And the other thing to keep in mind is that variables are really good documentation. So let me put both these things side by side without this, because that's just making it. Okay, so you know, in this first version, I'm calling the callback and I'm passing it the parsed data, right? And you can kind of look at that line and see that. Having this variable allows me to name what the parsed data actually represents semantically. And that may help me in 2 months when I come back and have to understand this code again, or the next person that comes back and reads it, kind of better follow the story of what's going on. So a lot of times just creating a variable, even if you're just going to create a variable that only lives for one more line just to get passed somewhere else, it kind of serves as a comment in a way, and gives this suddenly this like parsed JSON data isn't this anonymous parsed data that who knows what it is, like, oh, it's tasks, I know what that is. So it's just a little bit more self-documenting. So that's not a real firm answer, but it's kind of a judgment call. And I would say
that's the reason I did it, though.
Yeah. Hey, there you go. So yeah, it's definitely. I think there's a lot of times it's tempting once you start to figure out. You know, when you start learning a new programming language, your code is just really verbose because you haven't learned the quick idioms or the tricky ways to like do things in shorter, more concise statements. But then you can sort of go to the other end where people keep saying, oh, you could do that in less code. You could do that in less code. You can go all the way to the other end when you're like, well, shoot, I could just, I mean, you want me to do it on one line. Boom, that's a one-liner, you know, it's less code, right? And it does the same thing, but like nobody knows what that line does now. It's really hard to read. So there's definitely a balance. And a lot of times, you know, unless you're programming, you know, a Dick Tracy watch or something where you have like limited memory constraints, like code is free. White space is free, variables are free. So if you can write a little bit more code or use a little bit more space or add a couple variables with good names here and there, even if it makes your code longer, it can make your code more readable just because it's giving more of a story and making your code read a little bit more like a story, you know, like, oh, I'm parsing the data into tasks, you know, and it can be more helpful. Another question.
Also
yeah.
On that same line there, that var could be a const, right?
It could. That is correct. Yeah.
And earlier, I think you said that var and let have do basically the same thing, but I thought I had read that var gets hoisted and let does not.
Oh, that is very possible. When I said that thing about var and let being the same, a little voice in my head said, you don't know that for sure. And I don't know that for sure. and that thing about the hoisting sounds familiar, and so that's very possible that they're not exactly the same. But I couldn't say that for sure. That would be something to look up. In general, hoisting is something that surprises most people. So I'd probably like in the code that I've been writing and the code that we've been writing for the Echo system, we never use var. We always use let and const. And I've never come across a situation where like, oh, I really wish this variable was getting hoisted. Or so in practice, I would say, use let and const. It's a little just more explicit what's going on. But definitely ask another SEP and see if they have the same answer.
Trevor, is it okay if I tackle this one real quick?
Yeah, huh?
So there was this one article from this person, you don't know, JS, where he essentially was he was doing a video called The Good Parts of Es6, and he goes into a very long rant about the definition between the three of them and why you can still use var interchangeably between the two of them, and it's honestly not that big of a deal as long as you're going along with it. I just use variables like var like that to declare kind of like a variable, like something that's going to change later on, or like something that I'm going to be reusing. Let is something like I view as something a little bit more temporary, and then const is just like it's going to constantly be there. So like variables aren't a bad thing, and you can still use them in ES6. There's not going to be like some kind of JavaScript god that's going to come in and strike you down for using our keyword. It is easier, and like it I don't know, like his whole reasoning behind it is it just using variable for something that's not going to change, or like the difference between mutability and immutable things like that. He says just use var when you're not sure, or if it's like kind of just something that you're going to throw away, or just use it just in general, because like it's nice to use that as like an extra layer of definition while you're making your things to make it more readable for people who don't use ES6, or for just, I don't know, the future. So you kind of understand like what's happening with the variable going into it, right? I don't know if I just kind of went on a tangent there.
Yeah, he's saying use var to, that's an argument for using var or for using const and let?
For using var.
I gotcha, yeah.
This guy, like, he said use var all the time. Well, he was also like, he's been using JavaScript for a long time. He's a little bit of a snob from the video that he was coming across like a code snob a little bit. And
gotcha.
Use var all the time, use const sometimes, and you can use let, but don't. But again, like everybody has an opinion about it, and it's one of those things where you can use it if you want to.
Yeah, that is true. Everyone, it's the kind of thing that programmers like to have passionate opinions and argue about. I would say my gut is that if const is given to us in the language like it is now, that it's worth using if you're declaring something you don't intend to change, because you get that happy feature. If you change it on accident without meaning to, you'll get yelled at, and that's kind of a nice feature. And it also sort of it's a hint to people reading your code that like I'm declaring this variable, but not because I want it. It won't be changed later. Like the thing that it holds will stay constant. And that's providing a little more semantic meaning to your code. So that would be my take on it. But again, different smart people have different opinions on it. So there's not a hard and fast rule for sure. Okay, so there was one other question here I want to get to in the chat about, is there an easy way to know what arguments to put into a callback function like error data, or do you have to read the documentation? And somebody was mentioning like code editors that have like inline documentation that show you what to use, and that is a good answer. There's also, so like for FS readline, certain editors will they'll see that you're using this built-in function and the documentation is like publicly available, and they'll be able to tell you like, oh, the callback, it should accept these arguments. And it's worth noting that this is a node style callback. This specific thing about like the first argument to the callback is an error, and the second one is the result of whatever whatever the callback is waiting for. That's a standard that's used in the node code base. So all of these like built-in file system functions and other like built-in node functions use that convention. And because of that, a lot of code that is written in Node and like other NPM modules and libraries you'll download, you'll see using this same format. So this has become kind of a standard. So if you're writing a method, if you're writing your own method that takes a callback function, like we did up here, then it would probably behoove us to like make our callback behave the same way. So instead of throwing this error, I might say return callback error. And then when we call it in the successful case, just return a null error. So yes, if it's code, if you're using like a library or something, you're just gonna have to read the documentation, or maybe you have an editor that reads the documentation for you. And then if you're working in a code base where like there's things in the code base that have been defined, hopefully there's documentation on your own code, or you're following some sort of regular convention to help keep it straight. And then someone says, so the read file function creates the values for those arguments and passes them into the callback. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what's happening. Yeah, so read file sort of like, initiates the file read, and then if there's an error, it calls whatever the callback function is and it passes it that error. And if there's not, it sort of waits until the read is complete and then calls the callback function with the string of the data that's been read in. Just like we're doing here in our like load tasks function here, where we're like taking a callback and then we're doing some stuff and then we're calling the callback differently in different situations. Callbacks all the way down. Cool. Any other questions? Things y'all want to talk about?
I have a small question.
Mm-hmm.
To ask. Do you usually use parameters or arguments? Which term?
Oh, which term do I use? I'm not sure. My guess is that I probably use them both interchangeably. I'm not real specific about like whether I call it a parameter or an argument. Honestly, different programming languages or different like program language communities tend to use different terms. And I've worked in enough different languages over the past few years that like I'm a little bit of a mess. Similarly, like with functions. So like in Perl, a function is called a subroutine. And in a lot of object-oriented languages like Ruby, they tend to talk about functions as methods. Some people will tell you that like if it's a method, if it's an object with like a function, then it's a method of the object. But if it's like a functional programming function, you have to call it a function or a subroutine. And it's the same thing with like arguments and parameters. I'm sure, I think it's a safe bet about anything that there are people on the internet with strong opinions about it. But I know arguments and parameters, there's probably like a right way to say it. And there are probably people that have opinions about what that right way is. In general, though, I think I use the terms interchangeably, and they are pretty synonymous. I haven't run into a lot of conversations where people got confused when they were like, wait, you said parameters, did you mean arguments? Like, I think you can safely use those terms interchangeably. Yeah. You will hear, though, if you're for commands on the command line, like in a bash shell, those are consistently called arguments. They're command line arguments. You rarely hear anyone say parameters when talking about like invoking a command in bash. It's always arguments in that case. I don't know why.
I thought when you invoke a function, like that's when you would put in an argument. And where it says function load tasks that takes in a callback, I think that's usually where you put in parameters. That's what.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe you're right. I believe you're right. So the parameters are sort of like when you're defining the function, the function takes certain parameter, like has different parameters, and the arguments are the actual things you're passing into the function when you're calling it. I believe that. That sounds reasonable. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even when you use process.arg, use like an argument. So an argument when you're taking the elements, entering input in a node.
Say that again, Yassine. Your sound is like really.
Oh, there's like that method, you know, when you're actually trying to access, take elements from input, you know, insert it into nodes. I remember there's a method called process.arg.
Yeah, argv. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
The third argument. So here,
yeah. So in that case, yeah, the arguments are, yeah. Like I said, for the like command arguments are usually, or pretty much always referred to as arguments. So Thomas had a question, does the add function still work if the list.json file exists but is empty? And that is a really good question. Let's see. That is like a QA person's question. It's really good. I think it will not. Let's see. So add reads in the file and then parses. Yeah. So if you try and parse the file and the file is just empty, then you're either going to get like an empty string here when you parse it, or you might get an error trying to parse like an empty file if data is an empty string. I guess there's an easy way to find out what happens if we try and parse an empty string as JSON. Yeah. So you'd get an error trying to parse the file into JSON if it were empty. And so your add would never quite work. And your list wouldn't work there too. So that might be another like improvement you could make to this is like, you know, how do you handle the first time somebody runs this program and they haven't saved any tasks yet? Like, how do you initialize that file? The other thing you might consider doing is like storing the file in the code base and checking it into the code base is like probably not exactly what the behavior that you'd want. And so you might look into like ways to store this file in a more common place. One place you could store it is in the home directory, like find the user's home directory and stick a hidden file there that you store this list.json in. Kind of the same way that your bash RC lives there, and other programs that have like configuration file or need to store data will like stick a dot file in your home directory. You could play around with trying to do that as well. Cool. All right, well, it is a minute to the hour, so I'm gonna wrap us up here. Thank you all for showing up and having good questions and letting me dig through your code. And we're gonna be doing this every Friday. So if you're working on something and you want feedback from it, two things. If you're working on something and you want feedback from it and you don't want me to do it in front of a bunch of other people, still send it to me. I'm happy to do code reviews like this, either asynchronously and just like send you notes, or jump on a Zoom call and walk through it if you have code that you're just kind of want to get some feedback, like, oh, how am I doing? How could this be better? And if you've done something that you think would be useful for other people to go through, then send it to me and let me know you don't mind doing it on a Friday, because we're going to try and do this every Friday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Trevor.
Mm-hmm.